Wealthy heir forced to date a housekeeper. Her secret changes everything. Alexander lounged on the leather couch in his father's office, his feet propped up on the glass coffee table. The faint clink of a crystal decanter echoed as Mr. Hargrove poured himself a drink, his jaw tight with frustration. "You think this is funny, don't you?" Mr. Hargrove's voice was low, controlled, but the anger simmered just beneath the surface. He turned to face his son, holding the glass tightly as if it might crack under his grip. Alexander smirked, barely glancing up from his phone. "Not funny exactly. But I can't say I'm surprised. You've always loved theatrics, father?" Mr. Hargrove set the glass down with a sharp clink, the sound reverberating in the silence that followed. "You embarrassed this family again, Alexander? A fight at a charity gala? Drunken antics plastered across every gossip column?" "It wasn't a fight," Alexander replied lazily, finally meeting his father's steely gaze. "It was a disagreement?" "A disagreement," Mr. Hargrove repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And the broken vase worth more than most people's yearly salaries? A casualty of your disagreement, I suppose?" Alexander shrugged, unbothered. "Accidents happen." Mr. Hargrove studied his son for a long moment, his face a mask of disappointment. "This stops now," he said, his tone final. "You've been given every opportunity, an education, wealth, connections, and yet you squander it all. So, I've decided it's time for a change." Alexander raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. "A change?" "Yes," Mr. Hargrove said, straightening his posture. "You're going to learn some humility whether you like it or not." Before Alexander could respond, Mr. Hargrove pressed a button on his desk phone. A moment later the door opened and Clara stepped in, her uniform crisp but modest. Her eyes darted nervously between father and son as she waited for instructions. "This," Mr. Hargrove continued, gesturing toward Clara, "is Clara. She's one of our housekeepers. And for the next 3 months you're going to date her." The room fell silent. Alexander blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. Then he laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. "You're joking." "I'm not," Mr. Hargrove replied calmly. "You'll spend time with someone outside your privileged bubble. Someone who understands the value of hard work and dignity. Maybe then you'll begin to appreciate the life you've been handed." Clara's eyes widened, her cheeks flushing. "Sir, This isn't negotiable, Clara," Mr. Hargrove interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "You'll be compensated for your time. I understand this is unusual, but I trust you'll conduct yourself with professionalism." Alexander stood abruptly, the legs of the chair scraping against the floor. "You can't be serious," he said, glaring at his father. "This is ridiculous." "What's ridiculous," Mr. Hargrove shot back, "is the way you've been living your life. Consider this an opportunity. If you refuse, you'll lose access to your trust fund. Effective immediately." Alexander's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. For a moment, it seemed like he might argue, but then he turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Clara stood frozen, unsure of what to say or do. Mr. Hargrove gave her a small nod of reassurance. "You'll be fine, Clara," he said. "Just be yourself." The next day, Alexander was uncharacteristically quiet as he sat across from Clara at a small cafe in the city. He stirred his coffee absently, avoiding her gaze. Clara, meanwhile, focused on the menu, her discomfort palpable. "So," Alexander said finally, breaking the silence. "You don't have to do this, you know." Clara looked up, startled. "Excuse me?" "This whole charade," he said, waving a hand vaguely. "My father has a flair for dramatics, but you don't have to play along. Just tell him we went out and I'll handle the rest." Clara frowned, setting her menu down. "I need this job, Mr. Hargrove. And if this is part of it, then I'll do what's asked of me." Alexander studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You're serious?" "Yes," she said firmly. "And I'd appreciate it if you didn't make this harder than it has to be." He leaned back in his chair, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Fair enough. But let's get one thing straight. This isn't a date. It's a business arrangement. Understood?" Clara nodded, her expression neutral. "Understood." The weeks that followed were a blur of awkward outings and forced interactions. Alexander was distant and dismissive, treating their time together as an inconvenience. Clara, meanwhile, remained professional, enduring his sarcasm and jabs with quiet resilience. But as time passed, small moments began to shift the dynamic between them. During a charity event, Alexander overheard Clara speaking with an elderly guest in fluent French, her voice soft and confident. He watched, surprised as the guest's face lit up, clearly impressed. "Where did you learn French?" Alexander asked later, unable to hide his curiosity. Clara hesitated, her expression guarded. "My mother taught me." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "And what does your mother do?" "She passed away," Clara said simply, her tone leaving no room for further questions. For the first time, Alexander felt a pang of guilt for his previous behavior. He realized he knew almost nothing about Clara, despite spending weeks in her company. And for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he found himself wanting to know more. As the days turned into weeks, Alexander found himself noticing things about Clara that he hadn't paid attention to before. Her quiet determination, the way she held herself with grace even in uncomfortable situations, and her knack for handling people with a calm, steady demeanor, was unexpected. One afternoon, during a trip to the botanical gardens, an outing suggested by Mr. Hargrove, Alexander found himself asking Clara about her interests. At first, she hesitated, clearly wary of his intentions. But when he pressed, she finally relented. "I enjoy reading," she said softly, her gaze fixed on a patch of vibrant orchids. "And music?" "Let me guess," Alexander said, his tone teasing. "Romance novels and pop ballads?" Clara glanced at him, her lips twitching in amusement. "Not quite. I prefer historical fiction and classical piano." He blinked, caught off guard. "You play?" "I used to," she admitted. "It's been a while." Alexander studied her, intrigued. "Why did you stop?" Clara hesitated, her fingers brushing against the petals of a nearby flower. "Life got in the way." It was a vague answer, but something in her tone told him not to push further. Still, the image of Clara seated at a piano, her fingers dancing across the keys, lingered in his mind. The outings continued, and with each one, the tension between them softened. Alexander's sarcasm became less biting, replaced by genuine curiosity. And Clara, despite her initial reservations, began to let her guard down. During a visit to a local art gallery, Alexander caught Clara staring at a painting, a vivid depiction of a stormy sea. Her expression was distant, as though lost in a memory. "Do you like it?" he asked, stepping beside her. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "There's so much emotion in it. The chaos, the strength, it's captivating." Alexander tilted his head, studying her rather than the painting. "You have an eye for these things." She smiled faintly. "My father used to take me to galleries when I was younger. He said art teaches us how to see the world differently." There it was again, another glimpse into her past, offered like a breadcrumb on a trail. Alexander felt an unfamiliar pang of curiosity, coupled with a growing respect for her depth. But not everyone was pleased with their growing rapport. During a dinner party hosted by one of Alexander's friends, Clara's presence sparked a flurry of whispers and sideways glances. One guest, a woman named Vanessa, made no effort to hide her disdain. "So," Vanessa said, her tone dripping with condescension, "you're the housekeeper I've heard so much about." Clara, unfazed, met her gaze steadily. "Yes, I am." Vanessa's smile was sharp, like the edge of a blade. "It must be quite the adjustment attending events like this. I imagine it's overwhelming." "Not at all," Clara replied, her voice calm. "Though I can see how it might be for someone less confident." The table fell silent, stunned by Clara's poise. Alexander, who had been watching the exchange closely, couldn't help but smirk. He raised his glass, silently toasting her victory. The moment stayed with Alexander long after the dinner ended. He realized that Clara wasn't just enduring the situation, she was thriving in her own quiet way. And for the first time he found himself genuinely looking forward to their next outing. But Clara, despite her growing comfort around Alexander, couldn't shake the weight of her secret. Every time he asked about her past, she deflected, unwilling to let him see the full picture. The truth was too complicated, too painful. And she wasn't ready for him, or anyone, to know. One evening, after another long day of work, Clara found herself in the mansion's library, seeking solace among the rows of books. She ran her fingers along the spines, her gaze landing on a well-worn copy of a piano composition book. "Do you play?" a voice asked, startling her. She turned to see Alexander standing in the doorway, his expression curious. "Not anymore," she said quickly, placing the book back on the shelf. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Why do I feel like there's more to that story?" Clara sighed, crossing her arms. "Because you're nosy." Alexander chuckled, leaning against the bookshelf. "Guilty as charged. But seriously, Clara, you're an enigma. Every time I think I've figured you out, you surprise me." She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Maybe some things are better left as mysteries? Maybe, he conceded, though his curiosity only deepened. Their dynamic continued to evolve, the lines between their roles becoming increasingly blurred. Alexander began to see Clara not as an obligation imposed by his father, but as someone who challenged him, intrigued him, and, if he was honest with himself, made him want to be better. And Clara, despite her best efforts to maintain her distance, found herself drawn to Alexander in ways she hadn't anticipated. His charm, his humor, and even his vulnerability, hidden beneath layers of arrogance, resonated with her more than she cared to admit. But the closer they grew, the more Clara worried about what would happen when her secret came to light. Because no matter how much she wanted to believe in the possibility of something real between them, she knew that the truth had the power to change everything. One rainy afternoon, Alexander found himself sitting in the sprawling living room, staring out at the sheets of water cascading down the windows. Clara walked in carrying a tray of tea, her movements calm and precise as always. "You don't have to do that," Alexander said, surprising himself with the statement. "You could have just called someone else." Clara set the tray down and glanced at him, her brows slightly raised. "It's my job." "It shouldn't be," he muttered, almost to himself. She paused, studying him for a moment before sitting down across from him. "Is something on your mind?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Just thinking about how ridiculous this whole arrangement is. My father forcing us into these outings. It's absurd." Clara poured herself a cup of tea, her movements deliberate. "Absurd maybe. But you're still here." Alexander frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," she said calmly, "that maybe you're starting to see the world differently. Even if you don't want to admit it." Her words struck a nerve, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Instead of responding, he reached for his own cup of tea, letting the silence stretch between them. The rain continued for days, creating a sense of intimacy and isolation within the mansion. With little else to do, Alexander and Clara spent more time together, their conversations growing deeper and more personal. One evening, as the storm raged outside, Alexander brought Clara to the music room. He hadn't planned on it, it was more of an impulse, driven by her earlier comment about playing piano. "I want to hear you play," he said, gesturing toward the grand piano that sat gleaming in the center of the room. Clara hesitated, her gaze flicking to the instrument. "It's been years." "Doesn't matter," Alexander said, his tone surprisingly gentle. "Just try." Slowly, Clara approached the piano and sat down. Her fingers hovered over the keys, hesitant, before finally pressing down. The first notes were shaky, uncertain, but as she continued, the music began to flow. Alexander watched, captivated. There was something raw and vulnerable in the way she played, as though each note carried a piece of her soul. When she finished, the room was silent except for the faint patter of rain against the windows. "You're incredible," Alexander said, his voice quiet. Clara stood abruptly, her expression guarded. "It's just a skill. Nothing special." "It is special," he insisted. "Why don't you play anymore?" She shook her head, avoiding his gaze. "Because it reminds me of a life I can't go back to." Before he could respond, she left the room, leaving him alone with the lingering melody. The days that followed were marked by a noticeable tension between them. Clara kept her distance, while Alexander found himself drawn to her more than ever. He couldn't shake the image of her at the piano, the emotions she had revealed through her music. One evening, he confronted her in the library where she was organizing books. "Why do you keep shutting me out?" he demanded. Clara glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Because you don't know me." "Then let me," he said, his voice softening. "I want to know you, Clara. The real you." She hesitated, torn between her growing feelings for him and the fear of what he might think if he knew the truth. Finally she spoke. "If you knew who I really was, you wouldn't feel the same." "Try me," he said, taking a step closer. Clara looked away, her hands gripping the edge of the bookshelf. "My family, we weren't always poor. My father was a businessman, successful and respected. But he trusted the wrong people. One of them betrayed him and we lost everything. He died shortly after and my mother followed not long after that. I've been on my own ever since." Alexander stared at her, stunned. I had no idea." "Why would you?" she said bitterly. "People like you never see past the surface." "That's not fair," he said, his tone defensive. "I've changed?" "Have you?" she asked, meeting his gaze. "Because all I see is someone who's still trying to figure out who they are." Her words hit harder than he expected, leaving him speechless. Clara brushed past him, her footsteps echoing through the quiet library. For days, Alexander couldn't stop thinking about their conversation. Her story had opened his eyes to the depth of her resilience, but it also forced him to confront his own shortcomings. She was right, he had spent his life coasting on privilege, never truly understanding what it meant to fight for something. Determined to prove her wrong, he threw himself into helping with the foundation his father supported, a move that surprised even Mr. Hargrove. "What's gotten into you?" his father asked one morning, watching as Alexander reviewed proposals. "Just trying to do something meaningful for once," Alexander replied, his tone clipped. Mr. Hargrove raised an eyebrow but said nothing more. Meanwhile, Clara struggled with her own feelings. Despite her reservations, she couldn't deny the connection she felt with Alexander. But her fear of being hurt, or worse, pitted, kept her walls firmly in place. Her resolve was tested during a gala hosted by Mr. Hargrove. Clara was tasked with overseeing the event, ensuring everything ran smoothly. She planned to stay in the background, but fate had other plans. As she moved through the crowd, checking on the staff, she caught sight of Alexander. He was speaking with a group of guests, his demeanor confident and charming. But when he saw her, his expression softened. "Clara," he said, stepping toward her. "You look amazing." She glanced down at her simple dress, feeling out of place among the opulence. "I'm just doing my job." "You're more than that," he said firmly. "Come with me." Before she could protest, he led her to the center of the room, drawing the attention of everyone around them. Whispers rippled through the crowd as Alexander raised his glass. "I want to take a moment to recognize someone who's been a constant source of strength and inspiration," he said, his gaze fixed on Clara. "She's taught me more about life in a few months than I've learned in years." "Clara, thank you." The applause that followed was hesitant at first, then grew louder. Clara's cheeks burned as she met Alexander's gaze, her emotions a whirlwind of confusion and gratitude. As the applause subsided, Clara's chest tightened. Standing under the gaze of so many people, their judgment heavy in the air, she felt exposed. She forced a small smile, nodding politely, but as soon as the opportunity arose, she slipped away from the crowd and out onto the balcony. The cool night air was a relief against her flushed cheeks. She gripped the railing tightly, staring out at the city lights, her thoughts swirling. What was Alexander thinking, putting her in the spotlight like that? It wasn't gratitude she had seen in the eyes of those guests. It was confusion, disdain, and a hint of mockery. She heard footsteps behind her and tensed, knowing who it would be. "Clara," Alexander said softly, his voice carrying a note of concern. "Why did you leave?" She turned to face him, her expression guarded. "You shouldn't have done that." "Done what?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. "Made me the center of attention," she said, her tone sharper than she intended. "I don't belong in that room. Not the way they see me." "Who cares how they see you?" he countered, stepping closer. "You belong anywhere you want to be. And if they can't see how incredible you are, that's their problem, not yours." Clara looked away, her heart pounding. "It's not that simple, Alexander. You don't understand what it's like to be judged, dismissed like you're less than nothing." He reached out, his hand brushing against hers. "You're not nothing, Clara. Not to me." Her breath hitched at the sincerity in his voice, but she quickly pulled her hand away. "You say that now. But what happens when the novelty wears off? When the people in that room start whispering about how I'm not good enough for you? They can whisper all they want," he said firmly. "I don't care. You should," she said, her voice breaking. "Because one day you'll realize they're right." She turned and walked away before he could respond, leaving him standing alone on the balcony, frustration and helplessness etched on his face. The next morning, Clara avoided Alexander as much as possible, focusing on her work and keeping herself busy. But it wasn't long before she was summoned to Mr. Hargrove's office. She braced herself, unsure of what to expect. When she entered, Mr. Hargrove was seated at his desk, his expression unreadable. "Clara, have a seat." She obeyed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I've been hearing things," he began, leaning back in his chair. "About you and Alexander." Her stomach dropped. "Sir, I assure you." "Relax," he interrupted, holding up a hand. "I'm not here to accuse you of anything. In fact, I've noticed a change in him lately. He's more focused, more responsible. And I can't help but think you've had something to do with that." Clara blinked, taken aback. "I'm just doing my job, sir." Mr. Hargrove studied her, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "Perhaps. But I need to know something, Clara. Are you serious about him?" She hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I don't know." "That's not good enough," he said, his tone firm. "Alexander is my son, and while he may act like he doesn't care about anything, I know better. If you're going to be in his life, you need to be honest, with him and with yourself. Clara swallowed hard, her mind racing. I understand. Good, he said, his tone softening slightly. Because he's not as strong as he pretends to be. And neither are you if you keep running from whatever it is you're hiding. That conversation lingered in Clara's mind, gnawing at her as she tried to focus on her tasks. She knew Mr. Hargrove was right, about Alexander, about her secrets, about everything. But the thought of opening up, of letting someone see the parts of herself she'd worked so hard to protect, was terrifying. That evening, as she prepared to leave for the day, she found Alexander waiting for her by the front door. Can we talk? He asked, his voice hesitant. She sighed, knowing she couldn't avoid him forever. All right. They walked together to the garden, the twilight casting long shadows across the manicured hedges. Alexander stopped by a bench and motioned for her to sit. She remained standing, crossing her arms defensively. I don't want to fight, he said, his tone gentle. I need to understand why you keep pushing me away. Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with conflict. Because this, whatever this is, won't work. You and I are from two completely different worlds, Alexander. And no matter how much you say it doesn't matter, it does. It doesn't matter to me, he insisted. Why can't that be enough? Because it's not just about you, she said, her voice rising. It's about me and the things I've been through, and the people who will never let me forget where I come from. Then tell me, he said, stepping closer. Tell me everything, Clara. I'm not going anywhere. Her defenses crumbled and she let out a shaky breath. You want to know the truth? Fine. My father was a businessman just like your father. He trusted someone he thought was a friend, a partner. But that man betrayed him, ruined him. We lost everything. My father couldn't handle the shame and it killed him. And my mother, she didn't last much longer. Alexander's eyes widened, the weight of her words sinking in. Clara, I didn't know. Of course you didn't, she said bitterly. Because people like you never have to think about people like me. You live in your mansions, surrounded by wealth and power, while the rest of us scrape by trying to survive. I'm not that person anymore, he said, his voice filled with emotion. You've changed me, Clara. You've shown me what it means to fight, to care, to be better. Don't push me away because you're afraid. She looked at him, her walls beginning to crack. And what happens when your father finds out who I really am? When he realizes I'm the daughter of the man who tried to take him down? Alexander froze, the realization dawning on him. But instead of pulling away, he reached for her hand. Then we'll face it together, he said firmly. Because I'm not going to lose you, Clara. Not now. Not ever. Clara stared at Alexander, her breath catching at the sincerity in his voice. Part of her wanted to believe him, to let herself hope that they could navigate the storm together. But another part of her, the part hardened by years of disappointment and survival, screamed that it was impossible. Alexander, she said softly, pulling her hand away. You don't understand what you're saying. Your father, he'll never forgive this. He'll never forgive me. Then I'll make him understand, Alexander replied, his tone resolute. I'm not afraid of him, Clara. Not when it comes to you. She shook her head, turning away. You think it's that simple? That your words are enough to change years of hatred and judgment? I don't think it'll be simple, he admitted. But I do think you're worth it. Clara closed her eyes, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She wanted to believe him, but the fear of what might come next was overwhelming. I need time, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to think. The days that followed were filled with a tense silence between them. Clara threw herself into her work, avoiding Alexander whenever possible. He, in turn, respected her space but watched her from a distance, his heart aching with every glance. Meanwhile, Mr. Hargrove began to notice the shift in his son's behavior. Alexander was more serious, more focused, but also more distant. One evening, as they sat in the study, Mr. Hargrove decided to confront him. You've been distracted lately, he said, setting down his glass of scotch. Is there something on your mind? Alexander hesitated, his jaw tightening. Nothing important. Mr. Hargrove studied him for a moment, his sharp eyes narrowing. This is about Clara, isn't it? Alexander's head snapped up, surprise flashing across his face. What makes you think that? Because I've been watching you, his father replied. And because I know you. You've always been transparent when it comes to your emotions. Alexander leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. What if it is about her? Mr. Hargrove sighed, his expression hardening. Alexander, I allowed this arrangement to teach you a lesson. To show you what life is like for those who don't have the privileges you take for granted. But that's all it was ever meant to be, A lesson? And what if it's more than that? Alexander challenged, his voice rising. What if she's more than that? Then you're making a mistake, Mr. Hargrove said bluntly. Clara is a fine young woman, but she's not someone who belongs in our world. You'd be setting yourself up for a lifetime of conflict and misery, or I'd be choosing someone who actually cares about me for who I am, Alexander shot back. Not for my money or my name. His father's expression darkened. You're being naive. And you're being a snob, Alexander retorted, standing abruptly. You talk about teaching me lessons, but maybe it's time you learned one yourself. With that, he stormed out of the room, leaving Mr. Hargrove staring after him, a mix of anger and frustration on his face. That night, Clara sat in her small room, the weight of her secret pressing heavily on her chest. She thought about Alexander's words, about the way he had looked at her, like she was the most important person in the world. It scared her, but it also filled her with a longing she hadn't felt in years. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She opened it to find Mrs. Hargrove standing there, her expression unreadable. "May I come in?" she asked politely. Clara nodded, stepping aside to let her in. "I've been meaning to speak with you," Mrs. Hargrove said, taking a seat on the edge of the bed. "About Alexander." Clara's heart sank, dread pooling in her stomach. "What about him?" Mrs. Hargrove sighed, folding her hands in her lap. "You've become important to him. That much is clear. And while I don't approve of how this situation came to be, I do believe you've had a positive influence on him." Clara blinked, surprised by the admission. "Thank you. But," Mrs. Hargrove continued, her tone soft but firm, "you need to understand the consequences of your relationship. Our world is unforgiving. People will judge you, scrutinize you, and they won't be kind. I've seen it happen before, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone." Clara looked down, her hands twisting nervously. "I know." Mrs. Hargrove reached out, placing a gentle hand on hers. "If you care about Alexander, you need to think carefully about whether this is something you're ready for. Because once the truth comes out, there's no going back." The following day, Alexander confronted Clara in the garden, his frustration finally boiling over. "Are you just going to keep avoiding me?" he demanded. "I'm not avoiding you," Clara replied, her voice calm but strained. "I'm trying to figure out what to do." "What to do about what?" he asked, his tone sharp. "About us." "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "About us. About this ridiculous situation we're in. About the fact that no matter how much we care about each other, it might not be enough." "Why not?" he asked, stepping closer. "Why can't it be enough?" "Because your father will never accept me," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "And even if he did, the rest of your world never will. Do you know what it's like to be looked down on every single day? To feel like you don't belong?" Alexander reached out, gently wiping a tear from her cheek. "Then we'll make our own world. One where you do belong. Where we both do." Clara's heart ached at his words, but the fear still lingered. "What if it's not enough?" she whispered. "It will be," he said firmly. "Because I'll make sure of it." Clara didn't answer Alexander right away. His words lingered in the air, heavy with promise and conviction, but they did little to dispel her doubts. She looked away, her gaze fixed on the blooming roses in the garden. "You make it sound so simple," she said finally, her voice quiet. "It is simple," Alexander replied, his tone softening. "It's not about them, Clara. It's about us. What we want. What we can build together." Clara shook her head, her hands gripping the edge of the stone bench she sat on. "You don't understand. Your world, it's cruel. People like me were nothing more than a novelty to them. Something to gossip about over their champagne. Then we'll leave that world," Alexander said, his voice gaining strength. "I'm tired of living my life by their rules. If they can't accept you, then I don't want anything to do with them." Her breath caught and she turned to face him. "Do you mean that?" "Every word," he said, taking her hands in his. "I've spent my whole life trying to live up to expectations I didn't even set for myself. But for the first time, I found something that matters to me. Someone who matters." Tears pricked at Clara's eyes, but she blinked them away, unwilling to let herself believe in something that felt too good to be true. "You're asking me to trust you. To risk everything." "I know," Alexander said, his grip tightening slightly. "And I'll prove to you that I'm worth that trust. Just give me a chance." She studied him, searching his face for any sign of doubt or hesitation. But all she saw was determination. And for the first time she allowed herself to hope, just a little. "All right," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you have to promise me something." "Anything," he said immediately. When things get hard, she said, her gaze locking onto his, you don't give up. No matter what. I promise, Alexander said, his voice steady and sure. Over the next few days, Alexander made good on his promise. He began openly spending more time with Clara, inviting her to events and outings despite the disapproving looks and whispers from his social circle. At first, Clara struggled with the attention, feeling like every pair of eyes was judging her, every hushed conversation was about her. But Alexander was there, always by her side, offering quiet reassurances that made the world feel a little less hostile. Ignore them, he would whisper, his hand lightly touching hers. They don't matter. Despite his support, the pressure continued to build. One evening, during a dinner party hosted by one of Alexander's longtime friends, the tension finally boiled over. So, a woman named Marissa said, her tone sharp and laced with condescension, "You're the famous Clara we've been hearing so much about." Clara smiled politely, though her stomach twisted at the pointed remark. "I suppose I am." Marissa's smile didn't reach her eyes. "It's fascinating, really." Alexander's always had a flair for the unconventional. But this is quite the departure. "Marissa," Alexander said warningly, his voice low. "What?" Marissa replied innocently. "I'm just curious. Tell me, Clara, what's it like going from scrubbing floors to, well, whatever this is?" Clara's cheeks burned, but she refused to let Marissa see how much her words stung. "It's certainly been an adjustment," she said evenly. "But I've found that the measure of a person isn't where they come from, it's how they treat others." Alexander smirked, clearly pleased with her response, but Marissa's expression soured. "Well," she said, her tone icy, "I suppose we'll see how long this little experiment lasts." Clara didn't reply, but as Marissa turned away, she felt Alexander's hand slip into hers under the table. She glanced at him and he gave her a small, reassuring smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to steady her nerves. Despite moments like these, the bond between Alexander and Clara continued to grow stronger. He began opening up to her about his own struggles, the expectations placed on him by his father, the pressure to always appear perfect, the loneliness that came with never feeling truly understood. And Clara in turn began to share more of her past. She told him about her father, about the betrayal that destroyed her family, and about the years she spent working tirelessly to survive. Through these conversations, they found solace in each other, a connection that felt unshakable. But the world around them wasn't so forgiving. One afternoon, as Clara was finishing her tasks, she was approached by Mr. Hargrove. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in his posture was impossible to miss. "We need to talk," he said, his tone clipped. Clara followed him into his office, her heart pounding. As soon as the door closed, he turned to face her, his gaze sharp and unforgiving. "I've tolerated this relationship," he began, his voice cold. "But it's gone too far. You've become a distraction for Alexander. And worse, you've started to affect his judgment." "Sir, I don't," he interrupted, holding up a hand. "You've done well here, Clara. You've been loyal, hardworking. But this, whatever this is, needs to end. For both your sakes." Clara's chest tightened, but she forced herself to remain calm. "With all due respect, Mr. Hargrove, I care about Alexander. And I believe he cares about me." "That may be true," he said, his tone softening slightly. "But caring isn't enough. Not in this world. The sooner you accept that, the better." Clara wanted to argue, to defend what she and Alexander had built. But deep down she knew he was right. Their world would never make it easy for them. And as much as it hurt, she had to decide whether their love was worth the battle ahead. Clara left Mr. Hargrove's office with her mind racing. His words echoed in her ears, each one a painful reminder of the uphill battle she and Alexander faced. Part of her wanted to walk away to spare herself, and Alexander, the heartache she was certain would come. But another part of her, the part that had grown to care for him deeply, couldn't bear the thought of leaving. As she walked through the quiet halls of the mansion, she found herself standing outside the music room. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear the faint notes of a melody drifting out. Curious, she pushed the door open and saw Alexander sitting at the piano, his fingers moving clumsily over the keys. "What are you doing?" she asked, unable to hide her surprise. He looked up, his expression sheepish. "Trying to figure this thing out. You make it look so easy." Clara stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "It takes practice," she said, moving to stand beside him. "And patience?" Alexander chuckled. "Two things I'm not exactly known for." She smiled despite herself, reaching out to adjust his hands on the keys. "Here, try this." He followed her instructions, the notes sounding more coherent this time. Not bad, he said, grinning up at her. Maybe I'm a natural. Or maybe you just have a good teacher, she replied, her voice teasing. For a moment they forgot about the world outside the room. It was just the two of them sharing a quiet, simple moment. But reality wasn't far behind. The next day, Clara found herself called into Mrs. Hargrove's sitting room. The older woman was seated by the window, a cup of tea in her hands and a contemplative expression on her face. Sit, Clara, she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Clara obeyed, her nerves on edge. Is something wrong, Mrs. Hargrove? Not wrong necessarily, she replied, setting her cup down. But I wanted to talk to you about Alexander. Clara's stomach sank. She braced herself for another warning, another reminder of the impossibility of their relationship. He's always been headstrong, Mrs. Hargrove continued. Stubborn to a fault. But he's also kind in his own way. He has a good heart. Clara nodded, unsure of where this was going. I see the way he looks at you, Mrs. Hargrove said, her gaze piercing. And I see the way you look at him. It's clear that you care for each other. But caring isn't enough. I know, Clara said softly. Mrs. Hargrove leaned forward, her expression softening. What I mean is, you need to decide if you're willing to fight for this. Because it won't be easy. There will be challenges, judgment, and moments where you'll want to give up. But if you truly believe in what you have, then it will be worth it. Clara looked down at her hands, her mind racing. She wanted to believe Mrs. Hargrove's words, to hold on to the hope that their love could survive the obstacles ahead. But the fear of failure was overwhelming. Thank you, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Hargrove reached out, placing a gentle hand on hers. Whatever you decide, just remember that you're stronger than you think. Meanwhile, Alexander was having his own battle. His father's words lingered in his mind, filling him with frustration and defiance. He didn't want to lose Clara, but he couldn't ignore the power his father wielded over his life. The Hargrove name came with expectations, responsibilities, and a reputation that had been carefully cultivated over generations. But for the first time, Alexander questioned whether any of it was worth it. What good was wealth and power if it meant sacrificing the one person who made him feel truly alive? The tension came to a head during a family dinner. Mr. Hargrove, ever the traditionalist, had invited several business associates and their families, no doubt hoping to remind Alexander of his duty. Clara was there, serving as usual, her presence a constant source of both comfort and distraction for Alexander. As the evening wore on, one of the guests, a man named Richard, began asking pointed questions about Alexander's personal life. So, Alexander, Richard said, his tone light but laced with curiosity. I've been hearing rumors about a unique relationship you've taken on. Care to elaborate? Alexander's jaw tightened, but he forced a polite smile. I'm not sure what you're referring to. Oh, come now, Richard pressed, his grin widening. Surely you've heard the whispers. A certain housekeeper who's captured your attention? The room fell silent, all eyes on Alexander. He glanced at his father, whose expression was a mix of warning and anger, and then at Clara, who stood frozen at the edge of the room, her face pale. Her name is Clara, Alexander said finally, his voice steady. And yes, she's important to me. The tension in the room was palpable. Richard raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. Well, that's unexpected. It shouldn't be, Alexander said firmly. She's intelligent, kind, and more deserving of respect than most people in this room. His words hung in the air like a challenge, daring anyone to contradict him. Clara's heart raced, a mix of fear and pride surging through her. Mr. Hargrove cleared his throat, his tone cold. Alexander, a word. Now. Alexander followed his father into the study, his steps heavy with determination. As the door clicked shut behind them, Mr. Hargrove turned, his face a mask of fury. What do you think you're doing? He demanded, his voice low but seething. You've humiliated this family enough, but now you're publicly aligning yourself with someone I care about, Alexander interrupted, his tone unwavering. Someone who's proven herself to be far more than you or anyone else in that room is willing to see. Mr. Hargrove stared at his son, his expression darkening. This is not about her worth, Alexander. It's about the Hargrove name, the reputation we've spent generations building. You think this infatuation will be accepted by anyone in our world? I don't care about their acceptance, Alexander shot back. What I care about is living a life that actually means something. And I won't sacrifice Clara to appease your outdated ideas of what's acceptable. For a moment, Mr. Hargrove said nothing, his jaw tightening as he weighed his next words. If you choose this path, he said finally, his tone icy, then you choose it alone. No support. No inheritance. No connections. You'll be cut off, Alexander. Alexander hesitated, the weight of his father's ultimatum pressing down on him. But as he thought about Clara, her strength, her resilience, her unwavering kindness, he knew there was no choice to be made. Then so be it, he said, his voice steady. I'd rather have a life with her than a fortune without meaning. When Alexander returned to the dining room, the tension was palpable. Clara was gone, having slipped away during his absence. He felt a pang of guilt but pushed it aside, determined to find her. He searched the house until he found her in the kitchen, sitting at the small table with her head in her hands. She looked up as he entered, her eyes red but defiant. You shouldn't have done that, she said, her voice trembling. Now they're all going to hate you. Your father doesn't control my life anymore, Alexander interrupted, crossing the room to stand in front of her. I told him the truth about us, and I made my choice. Clara shook her head, tears spilling over. You didn't have to do that. You could have had everything, Alexander. Your inheritance, your future. You're my future, he said, taking her hands in his. Don't you get that? I don't care about the money or the connections or any of it. None of it means anything if you're not part of my life. Her defenses crumbled at his words and she let out a shaky breath. You're going to regret this. Never, he said, pulling her into his arms. Not for a second. News of Alexander's decision spread quickly, and the fallout was immediate. His friends and associates whispered behind his back, his father cut him off entirely, and the life he had once known began to crumble. But Alexander stood firm, his love for Clara giving him strength. Together they started to build a new life, one filled with hard work, determination, and a deep sense of purpose. Clara, inspired by Alexander's resilience, decided to pursue her own dreams. She returned to her love of music, using her story to inspire others. Alexander, no longer burdened by his family's expectations, found fulfillment in helping others, dedicating himself to causes that mattered to both him and Clara. Months later, as they stood on the stage of a small community center, Clara at the piano and Alexander addressing a crowd of supporters, they knew they had made the right choice. The journey had been difficult, but it had brought them something far more valuable than wealth or status. It had brought them love, purpose, and the freedom to be themselves. As Clara played the final notes of a heartfelt melody, Alexander took her hand, their smiles reflecting the joy they had found in each other. The crowd erupted into applause, but for Alexander and Clara, the only thing that mattered was the love they saw in each other's eyes. Thank you, Alexander said softly, leaning close to her. For everything. Clara smiled, her heart full. No, Alexander. Thank you, for choosing me. And as they stood together, hand in hand, they knew their story was just beginning.